I have bare feet because I'm an old hippie and I'm really nervous. Hello, Singapore. What a charming place it is. It's my first time here. I'm making over 25 years a tour of all of Southeast Asia. So I just have Myanmar and China to go now. So thank you for having me. Great food, nice hotel. I am going to talk a lot, so I'm going to do it fast. Try not to fall asleep. If you do, just ask me what you missed afterwards. Buy me a beer, tell me how much better I am than Jake Archibald, and it'll all be good. My talk is called, If You're Going Out of San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear Web Standards in Your Hair. As I've said, I'm an old hippie. And I made this slide myself. I'm available for freelance design work if anybody needs me. I'm here to talk about war and peace. I'm a hippie, I love peace, guys. I'm not talking about, huge, devastating clashes of civilizations. I'm talking about, not the really, really important things like this guy's icons. I fixed them for him. Yes, we can talk later about that. I'm talking about holy wars. Holy wars are kind of doctrinal clashes between different sects of a religion like Catholicism and Protestantism or Shia and Sunni. That matter greatly, hello man with a camera, matter greatly to the people involved, but to people outside, it's really, really incomprehensible. I'm talking about the kind of big questions like Beatles or the Stones, or Big Macs, or Whoppers, or Iron Maiden, or proper music. Sorry, Jake. We've had many, many holy web wars, IE versus Netscape, tables versus CSS, jQuery versus vanilla JavaScript, Angular versus Ember versus React, all these kind of things. And there's a new holy war that I am hoping to help solve today, so we can actually get away from holy wars and focus on the important things. The current holy war is about how to do styling in component-based development. So one side says, CSS is completely unsuitable for styling modern web applications, and CSS-in-JS is much better because JavaScript is better, and anything that can be written in JavaScript should be written in JavaScript, and that's true because Jeff Atwood says so, and your mum smells. The other side says, oh yeah, well you're just a back-end developer with no idea how the web is meant to work. You're so stupid you don't understand inheritance and you're scared of the cascade. Ha 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 ha. And your mum's so fat she has her own namespace. We've all heard these arguments, regardless of which side you're on. It doesn't really matter. Now, I love component-based development. I didn't used to, but I do now because it reminds me of when I was a software engineer writing Fortran and COBOL and 6502 assembler in the late 80s. Yes, I know, I might look 24, but I'm actually nearly 30. I'm talking mostly about React, but we could also talk, this could also be appropriate for web components, which is a spec that Alex Russell from Google has been heavily promoting. Google are really behind this. I don't want you to read too much into the fact that web components is pushed by Google, and it's an anagram of spec own entomb. That's just a coincidence, I'm absolutely certain. But I love component-based architecture because it reminds me of when I used to write little modules because the computer I worked on could only have 8K in memory at any one time, and we could take modules and share them and link them all together. I like reusability because I don't know about you, you're all terribly hardworking, but I'm really lazy, and if I can write something once and use it 1,000 times in the future while continuing to bill the client, I'm a happy guy and I get to go to the pub. I like composability. I like testability. If you have a small component, it's easy to do unit tests on it because a component is a unit. And I like shareability. I like to be able to give these to people on my team or put them on GitHub so other people in the world can take them, because that's what we do. We share stuff. Now, of course, you've all seen this GIF about the complexities of CSS, and maybe this isn't so true anymore. Now we have Flexbox and CSS grids. Use CSS grids. Jing gets $10 every time you use them from the W3C. But it's true that CSS for components is a bit of a pain in the arse, or ass, depending upon what you call your arse. We can talk about that later when we talk about toilet paper. The trouble with CSS for components is everything's global. You can't adequately scope your rules to a component easily, so styles can leak or clash. The order affects the cascade, and when you're pulling in lots of different components, that can easily become unmanageable and give you surprises. It's really hard to make an adequate dependency system for CSS. Also, it relies upon markup structure. Yes, your HTML doesn't need to know about your CSS, but often your CSS really needs to know about your HTML structure because you're using selectors that might depend upon it. And the problem, of course, is if you break something, it can break silently. When I used to work as the front-end developer of a governmental legal site in the UK, before the days of all the modern cool stuff we have now, it would be midnight on Saturday when I would copy over CSS changes by FTPing it to the live server. And then it was absolutely terrifying because some forgotten page in the 100,000 page CMS-driven system would have terrible font or the layout would break. And, well, that's why I look so terrible. That's why I look like this, because of all the stress of CSS breaking silently and me not being able to test for it. So we've invented something called CSS in JavaScript. This is probably CSS rules, but in some kind of object notation, like JSON, rather than the squiggly brackets we all love. This isn't new. Netscape 3 had this thing called JSSS, JavaScript Style Sheets. You could only use this JavaScript way to style things in Netscape 3. And they proposed it to the W3C. The W3C said, whatever, and like whatever, because it's 3 Ws. And so the Netscape people then wrote a CSS to JSSS converter, which is why in Netscape, if you turn JavaScript off, styles wouldn't apply with CSS. But anyway, this thing, JSSS, or as I like to call it, Jizz, didn't really take off terribly well. So I've looked at some of the CSS in JavaScript solutions. I counted 59 competing solutions on Michel Bertoli's list on GitHub. And I have an opinion about CSS in JS. I've looked at them, and I can exclusively reveal, without risk of contradiction, that CSS in JS is a sick, perverted world, a sadistic Candyland in the sky. Write it down, there will be a test later. Legal notice, other opinions are available. CSS is great. I love it. It's great because you get fantastic IDE support, whether you're using Visual Studio, that other thing, WebStorm, JetStorm, whatever, or Sublime or Atom, you're getting loads of IDE support for your CSS. You get syntax highlighting, you get code completion, validation, there's CSS generators, and there's a huge community who know and share tips about CSS. There's also designers. Anybody here a designer? A few of you. Well, these are designers in the wild, drinking some flat, skinny, soy white cappuccino, frothy thing, eating some avocado toast, lamenting they can't afford a house, and using Apple machines. And they're designing things. And the thing is, of course, these guys and girls are really great at designing stuff. And because we all do responsive design now, we don't design in Photoshop comps, we design in the browser. CSS is their tool. And we are making these expensive and highly creative people abandon their tool of choice to fit our development methodology, which is naughty of us, and it's discourteous, and it's just bad form. If you disagree, ask a designer to open up your computer and choose the fonts and colors that they want for your operating system and IDE, and then see if that makes you more or less productive and happy. I'm happy to do this for you myself. You've seen my design skills. I'm pretty good. CSS in JavaScript also costs us. You have to load a JS library to handle CSS creation at runtime. You're creating and modifying CSS at runtime, and if you're doing server-side rendering, and if you're not, why are you not doing it? You're doing the CSS twice, once on the server and then squirting it down the wire. So I've been consulting now for 7 or 8 months with Wix, who are a website builder, and I'm advising them on web standards because they wanted to solve the CSS for components problem. And I've been helping them and giving them fashion advice. This is my colleague Ido Rosenthal, and he was asleep in our smoking room in our Tel Aviv office. You can see that the famous CSS blind is above him. And he was dreaming about a solution. And in his dream, he wanted CSS that was modular and only scoped to a component. But he wanted it also to be dynamic. He wanted it to be performant, so working at build time rather than runtime. He wanted it to have all the capabilities that CSS also gives us, because many CSS-in-JS libraries, you can't even do things like hover. And he wanted compatibility with all the existing tooling. And he wanted to be able to customize components from the outside too, as well as have their styling wrapped up with the components. And we came up with this thing called Stylable, which is CSS for components. It's a preprocessor, like Less or Sass, for styling components with typed CSS. Basically, what we're trying to do is do for CSS what TypeScript does for JavaScript. So the first thing we wanted to do was abstract stuff so that your styling doesn't have to know about the internal architecture of the component. So if you had a component from another team or another company, and they change something about the internal markup structure, your CSS won't break. So what we decided to do was have custom states, like hover or focus. We wanted to be able to say, if you are a nav button in my gallery and it's in the state of loading, don't show it. It's a custom state like hover or focus. Of course, you can use those too, but this gives you custom ones. And we also use the pseudo element syntax here to address things that are inside a component without having to know the structure. Anything that you give a class name to is exposed as a pseudo element that you can hang styles from without having to know what the structure is, or if the structure changes, your CSS won't. With type CSS, you would get a superset, We've got inner parts of pseudo elements. We have custom pseudo classes, type-aware dependencies, IDE and build support, and we can optimize. We can do analysis at build time and do what we call rule set shaking, which is like tree shaking, but for rule sets. This gives us all kinds of useful developer tooling, like IDEs, like code completion. This is us using Stylable in Visual Studio with Stylable Intelligence plugin. And you can see that once it's analyzed your structures, it's offering you all of the pseudo classes and the internal stylable things that you might want to use, which makes your life much more productive. This is how it works. I don't want to go too deeply into the syntax because I don't want to bore you or waste your time or fall over that thing again. But I want to show you that this syntax is entirely compatible with CSS. So we use this ST for Stylable vendor prefix so that you don't get an error in your IDE. At build time, all of these vendor prefixes are compiled away, and it compiles down, transpiles down to static, valid, cross-browser, vanilla CSS. And of course, you can mix Stylable compiler directives with absolutely normal CSS. Because we're importing from a component, we're giving it a default name, extending it, and we can use all of our CSS as usual. We have a type system. You can define the gallery internals. This is saying this component can have states of loading or empty. To set them, you have to do this in JavaScript, depending upon when you know you're loading or you're empty. And you can do that by default. You do it with a data attribute, but you can customize that some more. The status of it at the moment is we have pseudo elements and classes, imports, mix-ins with JavaScript or TypeScript, theming, VS Code extension that I showed you for code completion, etc. Coming up, integrations with more things than just React and Webpack. And at the moment, we're working on pseudo classes with parameters. So you can say, if this is a column and its name is email, make it goldenrod, because goldenrod is the best color. Formatters, we know this is in other languages, and we want to be compatible with those. My guys committed this stuff to GitHub last week. I'm not actually sure if it's released yet, but it's in the repo. Declaration interfaces. So you can say, for example, you can style any of the colors or the fonts in this component, but you cannot actually change its layout. So you won't break it if you're laying out with grid or flexbox, for example. More integrations, and we're dog fooding it and battle testing it. The reason we've written this is because Wix has had a problem with its websites that it hosts, particularly on mobile, because everything is done with CSS that is made at runtime and sent down the wire to be parsed in JavaScript. It's very slow on mobile. This is much more performant, and within the next 6 months, you will see Stylable powering nearly all of Wix's 110 million websites that it hosts at the moment. Another thing we're doing is getting rid of lots of JavaScript layout. We've done some analysis, and we've realized that nearly all of the websites that currently have some JavaScript to lay them out can be done with CSS grid. So there will be about 100 million Wix websites using Stylable and CSS grid for layout, rather than runtime CSS-in-JS and rather than JavaScript. It's going to be a lot faster, and we're battle testing it for that. This is a robust system. And it's going to be compatible with web components, and we're also keeping a close eye on the Houdini spec, which is the ability to extend CSS with JavaScript. We've just committed that to the repo, so you can have JavaScript macros in your CSS that will compile at build time into static CSS. It's BDSM licensed, so you can get it right now and try it out. get them while they're hot. It's stylable.io, and the repo is github.com, wix, stylable. I want to emphasize that I do not hate JavaScript. This is me having a beer with Brendan Eich, who invented JavaScript, and Malcolm William Lee, who invented CSS. And you can see that we're all smiling, and none of us hit each other at any point until about the fourth or the fifth pint. And I'm not a Luddite. I used to be anti-frameworks when I was living in an ivory tower of web standards, and then I went into industry and saw how real industry makes websites, and it was eye-opening to me. I'm not afraid of frameworks. In Bucharest, somebody had written React, run! But I was not scared. I'm not scared of frameworks. If you want to use React and Angular Bootstrap Hubpack.js, use it. Knock yourself out. Do whatever makes your life faster and more productive. But remember that all of these things are just tools. They might be well-known tools, but they are just tools. And using your tools well is the definition of an artisan, or craftsman, or craftswoman, a worker in a skilled trade, especially one that involves making things by hand. But I prefer this Japanese word. Any Japanese people in the house? Good, then you won't hit me for mispronouncing it. Shokunin means not only having technical skill, but implies an attitude and social consciousness, a social obligation to work his best for the general welfare of the people, an obligation both material and spiritual. And I think that's what we've been in danger of losing sight of as we fight our holy wars. Now, I'm an HTML-aholic, okay? This is, it's actually a brand of clothing in Japan, so they kind of looked very weirdly at me at this department store when I lay down next to it. But I first encountered the web in 1999. So instead of talking about my employer's products, let's talk about me. Let's talk about me, okay, me. This is me a couple of years ago. Okay, this is me in '96 when I went to work in Bangkok, Thailand, setting up a school, a primary school and a kindergarten, which I set up and ran for a few years. And when I was there, here's some of my students. It's really nice. They're all married now, and they invited me to their weddings. Bless them. When I was in Thailand, I got sick. Basically, I lost the use of my left eye and my left leg and my arm. And I went to hospital because I had private medicine. And they diagnosed me with something called multiple sclerosis, which is lots of these in the brain. And I was really, really lucky because in Southeast Asia, multiple sclerosis is a really rare disease. It gets more and more prevalent the further north or south you go from the equator. So it's very big, very popular in Scotland, Norway, etc. But I was lucky because the lady who happened to be the duty neurologist had just done a year's work in an MS facility in the US. And because it's so rare in Southeast Asia, they couldn't give me any English language information. The only thing they could find was Xeroxes from a medical textbook full of encouraging photographs of autopsied brains, which, I don't know about you, but it didn't really make me feel better. But when I got out of hospital and taught myself to walk again, I went downstairs from my apartment in Pratunam in Bangkok, and there was this thing called an internet cafe. So I went to this internet cafe, and I typed in multiple sclerosis into Alta Vista, which was like Google, but powered by steam and black and white. And it came back with this, Julie's Joint, which is a global support network for people with MS. It was founded in '95 by Julie Howell. When you're first diagnosed, you may not know anything about MS or anybody who has it. It can be a scary and lonely time. I created Julie's Joint so that people living with this disease can get to know others around the world, to share experiences and give each other support. And that was great. instead of autopsied brains, I was talking to people who had the disease, had lived with it for a few years. It made me feel better and taught me that I hadn't been just handed a death sentence. There were people from the UK, USA, Australia, Canada, Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, rest of the world, etc. But this blew my mind because what I had here was a collective of different people around the world with different backgrounds, different hopes, different experiences, different kinds of computers, this is 99, all coming together to work together on something. And it made me realize that the web was where I wanted to work. So I went back to the UK and set up a publishing company for web professionals, became a web developer, became deputy CTO of Opera, and now I'm consulting for Wix, because this opened my eyes about the web. Weirdly, when I got back to the UK and set up a book publishing company, the first book we commissioned was about web accessibility, and one of the reviewers was a woman called Julie, who was the woman who set up that MS support site that I found in Bangkok. And we've become good friends. Here we are going to see the Sex Pistols. Here we are at a party for the 10th anniversary of that website. Here's Julie with my daughter going to an art gallery. And I met her and became friends with her through the web. And it made me think, what is the web? It's not loads of computers. It's on loads of computers, but that's not what it is. It's certainly not clouds. It's definitely not a series of tubes. This is what the web is. It's these African women. It's this blind guy in Toronto. It's these ladies on a bus that I photographed when I was visiting Bangladesh. It's this lady in Korea that I photographed. It is these two farmers in Thailand that I photographed. It's these guys that I found on a stock image. It's this man with Down syndrome on the New York subway. It is these ladies on the beach in South India that I photographed a year ago. The web is people, and people are here. There are more people living inside this circle than the rest of the world outside this circle. And that was fact-checked by the Washington Post. Asia is now 4 billion people. I've counted. By 2050, by 2050, the population of Asia will be 5 billion, the United Nations predicts. China, 1.3 billion people with a GDP growth of 7.7%. I don't know what the GDP growth of Singapore is, but in the West and in the US, they would kill to have growth at this level. On Black Friday and Cyber Monday in 2015, the last dates I have figures for, 2.9 billion US dollars changed hands in the US. On Double 11 Day, the 11th of November, 2015, in China, $9.2 billion changed hands. Total online retail spending in China reached $307 billion in 2013 and is forecast to grow at 20% until 2019, when it should exceed $1 trillion. The numbers of startups valued at $1 billion or over, that's China. Africa is 1 billion people now. By 2050, that will rise to 2 billion. By 2100, which may be a little late for me, but maybe not for you, by 2100, the population of the world will peak at 11 billion people. 5 billion of them will live in Africa. Now, Africa has relatively good connections now. This is a map of the submarine cables going into Africa. You can see it starts pretty small, and then it's getting bigger, and they're getting faster and faster connectivity. But of course, submarine cables go under the sea, and they end up at the shore. And Africa is really, really big. So whereas people on the outside, the shorelines of Africa, have good connectivity, People inside don't, and maps lie to us, or at least maps that are done in the Mercator projection. Africa is really, really, really big. You can fit China, the UK, India, the US, Eastern Europe in the landmass of Africa. So if you live here, away from the coasts, internet access is slow and really expensive. Landlocked countries pay higher prices for bandwidth. In Africa, for instance, being landlocked adds $232 monthly for fixed broadband. Imagine, I mean, in a rich economy like Singapore or the US or the UK, my paying $230 a month more for my broadband would be a real bummer. Imagine how prohibitive that is in low-income countries like sub-Saharan Africa. And it's the same for mobile broadband. The difference is 100-fold for landlocked countries. In Pakistan, it's $1.48 for a gigabyte of data a month. In Sao Tome and Principe, it's $170 US. But the paradox is, people become richer when their broadband becomes faster. The employment rate in connected areas relevant to unconnected areas increased by 4.2 and between 4.2 and 10% when fast internet became available. In most countries in our sample, the increase of skilled employment was bigger for workers with secondary or tertiary education, but those who only completed primary school are also more likely to hold down a job once fast internet becomes available. But it's not just about affordability. Despite the fact that Africa has the lowest income per capita of any region, affordability was only identified as the most important barrier in one of the 13 countries that the GSMA surveyed. Network coverage is not perceived as an issue for most countries. However, mobile broadband, 3G or 4G, still remains low in Africa. The biggest problem was a lack of awareness or locally relevant content. And a lack of digital skills. It's the same in Asia. A lack of awareness and locally relevant content was the most commonly cited barrier to internet adoption. 50% of websites in the world are in English, but that's only spoken by 10% of the speakers in those countries. Only 2% of the websites worldwide are in Mandarin, and 0.1% are in Hindi. In Africa, 7 of 10 people who do not use the web say they don't know how to use it, and 4 in 10 do not know what the internet is. And that's not just in emerging economies. In high-income Poland and Slovakia, 1/5 of adults cannot use a computer. In the States, 41% of seniors do not use the internet, 53% don't have broadband access, and 23% don't have cell phones. This is my friend Paul Arnett, and he tweeted this on Christmas Day. He's doing tech support. We heard about that earlier. Me on tech support. What buttons are on your screen? My mum, a hot water bottle, and a dentist chair. It's funny, right? But you can see her thinking here. The things that we take for granted as obvious are not. A friend of mine called Sophia Parvez does usability testing in rural areas in Pakistan. And she's given me permission to show you this video. I've edited it down, but it's still bloody painful. This is a guy in his 20s in Pakistan. He's a feature phone user. He's been given a smartphone, and he's been asked to Google the name of his favorite actress. Two minutes, 53 seconds. And he gives up at 3 minutes and 15 seconds. Of course, the problem he had was that his feature phone, a Nokia, had physical keys. He simply doesn't know how to call up the virtual keyboard. I show you that because the next time you make something that you think is incredibly intuitive, think of this guy. He's not an idiot. He just doesn't know how to do it. Now, of course, not everybody has trouble with smartphones. This Cambodian boy whom I met on a beach when I was on vacation in Cambodia, I don't speak any Khmer, but he was very interested in my Google Nexus 5X. Within 1 minute of me miming instructions, he'd managed to take this selfie of himself, a photograph which never fails to cheer me up when I'm feeling a bit melancholy. There's a digital divide, not just between the wealthy nations and emerging economies. There's a digital divide in Africa between poor and rich, old or young, rural or urban, and men and women. And there's a digital divide in India. When I landed in India last year to do some press and TV work, in the Times of India, they announced that rural mobile internet users grew by 93% year on year. But that 93% growth means that a staggering 9% of people in rural India have any internet access at all. That is compared with 53% in urban areas. The World Bank, in a report they published early last year called Digital Dividends, it's actually really interesting, and it's 370 pages. I know what has happened to my life. The World Bank have said making the internet universally accessible and affordable should be a global priority. The Web Foundation, which was founded by Timbo, or Sir Tim Berners-Lee to you, the Web Foundation said in a shocking blog post, in Nigeria, the data needed to watch 2 minutes of online video a day can cost more than sending your child to school for a month. In the words of the car parking machine in Chinatown in my home city of Birmingham, change is possible and change is coming. There's a grassroots initiative called Fast Africa, and they had lots of activities across lots of African cities in 2016. Fast Africa, they are agitating for fair and transparent ICT taxes. They want governments and donors to step up efforts. Agree on affordability, and affordability is defined as 1 gigabyte of mobile data for 2% of average income. And I was actually very pleased that yesterday the Broadband Commission of the UN has actually adopted this as their target for affordability. Fast Africa also wants public access solutions, things like computers in schools or community colleges which are open to the public after hours, and making getting women online a top priority. The World Bank, online work can prove particularly beneficial for women, youth, older workers, and the disabled who prefer the flexibility of working from home or working flexible hours. In India, women are 62% less likely to use the internet than men. In rural India, 2% of women use the internet, or actually no, 2% of the 9% of people who have internet access are female. The other 98% are male. But the paradox of this is we know that the web empowers women. Globally, in non-agricultural employment, women are 25% of the workforce. But in online working portals, 44% of the workforce are women. When asked why, women said the ability to earn extra money was not as important as the ability to work from home and work flexible hours, because worldwide, of course, women bear the brunt of the requirement to do child rearing, looking after sick or elderly relatives. Interestingly and sadly, the biggest disadvantage for women was payment is not good enough, which was much less of a disadvantage for men, suggesting that just like everywhere else in the world, there is a disastrously unfair pay gap between what women and men earn. It's not all bad news. I was recently in Kerala in South India. There They speak a language called Malayalam there. It's the only language name in the world which is a palindrome and spelt the same backwards, interestingly. And in Malayalam, this says Kudumbashri, and Kudumbashri translates as prosperity for the family. It's an initiative by the Keralan government. Interestingly, Kerala has the highest female literacy, the highest life expectancy, the lowest infant mortality in India, and it's consistently run by a democratically elected Marxist government, which is interesting. But they set up the Kudumbashri project to outsource IT services to cooperatives of women from poor backgrounds. 90% of those women had not worked outside the home before. Okay, so I've given you all these facts and figures which are pretty demoralizing. I didn't swear. Do not get me for the code of conduct. I said, oh, feet. I just tripped over. What can you do? You can make a progressive web app. I'm not going to go into what they are particularly now because I'm running over time. Doubtless you know. It is no coincidence that the best and earliest progressive web apps have come out of Asia and Africa. Indonesia, Kenya, Nigeria, India. Because downloading a typical app on an Indian network of 20 megabytes will take more than 30 minutes and more often than not just craps out. And cheaper Android devices are pretty low in storage. At Google I/O last year, it was announced that 25% of new Android shipments only have 512 meg of RAM and very low storage space. So if you have a massive downloadable app, even if the user can actually download it, it is taking up space on their phone. With space this limited, the user is comparing their personal photo collection with getting your app. We didn't stand a chance, said Birdly in their blog post, why you shouldn't bother creating a mobile app. We didn't stand a chance. We were fighting with both our competitors and other apps for a few more megabytes of room inside people's phones. A Nigerian developer that I interviewed a year ago said Nigerians are extremely data sensitive. They sideload apps and other content from third parties, and they never update them. With PWAs, without the download overhead of native apps, developers in Nigeria can now give a great and up-to-date experience for their users. What else can you do? You can simply optimize your images. In 2011, I had a slight hangover. It's a very unusual thing for me, but it was one of those times. And I'd read a blog post by Jake, and lots of developers had said it's really difficult doing images because if you send a really nice, shiny image to these new Retina devices on a 3-inch square black and white Nokia screen, it has to be compressed down, which takes CPU cycles and uses the battery, and people are downloading far more data than they actually need. Whereas if you give a low-resolution images, if you give a low-resolution image, it doesn't show very well on the Retina things. Yeah, you told me I can go on for as long as I want. There's only another 40 minutes. And you're fueling me now. The average web page, not website, not web app, is 4 meg, of which 1.8 meg is images. If you can make your images smaller with responsive images, you are using less bandwidth. I did a talk on responsive images because I was one of the team of handsome men who made the picture element, etc., that's in all the browsers now. And a developer saw my talk, and he put into practice the things I talked about, and then told me the next day his website, his web page, had gone down in size by 70%. Because that matters. In Germany, to afford entry-level mobile broadband for a month, you need to work 1 hour at average wage. In the States, you need to work 6 hours at average wage. In Brazil, you need to work 34 hours at average wage. And if you are sending down vast, bloated images, you are making Brazilian people work harder, and that's rude. Liberal hand-wringing ahead. Please guard the web as you work on it. It's a medium that has given you a great standard of living. It allows you to come to a nice aircon room and listen to interesting people and listen to me as well. And it gives you a nice middle-class life. It's been good to you. Make it good for other people. Preserve it. For example, someone or something or combination of people or things is using YouTube to frighten, traumatize, and abuse children automatically in scale, and it forces me to question my own beliefs about the internet at every level. This is available on Amazon. This is an iPhone cover of a woman having her armpits waxed. Of course, this doesn't actually exist. A bot has posted this, and if you were foolish enough to buy it, then they would make it on demand and send it to you. You can also get this rather nice iPhone case of toenail fungus, if you want to. Or more regrettably, and much less funnily, you can get this T-shirt made by a bot. Even worse, I was reading a really, really in-depth report about how fake news in Myanmar has contributed to the ethnic cleansing / genocide of the Rohingya Muslims. Access to the web is critical, but not sufficient, say the World Bank. The full benefits of the information and communication transformation will not be realized until countries continue to improve their business climate, invest in people's education, health, and good governance. But we need to do this. The developing countries are home to 94% of the global offline population, and those people deserve the benefits that we have realized from the web. If my hippie bullshit doesn't convince you, here's some numbers from a big management consultancy group called McKinsey. An increase in internet maturity similar to the one experienced in mature countries over the last 5 years creates an increase in real gross domestic product per capita of $500 on average during this period in 5 years. It took the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century 50 years to produce the same result. You, in this room, are the new Thomas Edisons. You are the new Isambard Kingdom Brunels. You are the new Thomas Telfords. You are the people who are building this for the next people. Do it properly, please. Remember, there are tens of millions of people in Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, who cannot afford a school textbook, but a feature phone with access to World Reader is textbooks. There are people who cannot afford basic medical care or have to walk miles for it, but feature phone access and the web and a copy of Where There Is No Doctor in their own language is medical care. There are people in horrible, repressive, totalitarian regimes who might have the wrong religion, the wrong political opinions, whose only access to the outside world is the web. There are 30-year-old scared men in a hospital bed believing they've been handed a death sentence, and the web makes that better. Do the right thing. Sorry for being boring. Bye.